Okay, well, welcome everyone back to another meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I am one of the two co-organizers along with Andres Scannon at Vanderbilt University. And so the OPSC started in 2015 as a way to extend the meetings of the Peace Science Society. We wanted to celebrate the excellent research that we already see in person at the conferences with more additional online meetings and opportunities to engage a wider community. So you can find us via the Peace Science website, which is hosted by UNT, and you can still find us, I believe, on X via the Online Peace Science Colloquium account. So we have a very cool paper today. So it is titled Contested Governance and Civilian Prosocial Behavior, Evidence from Lab in the Field Experiments in India. And we have three authors, Brandon Bolte, who is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Springfield, Vineeta Yadav, who is a professor at Penn State, and Bumba Mukherjee, who is a professor at Penn State University as well. And then we also have three really wonderful discussants. We have Christopher Blair, who's an assistant professor at Princeton University, Danny Hirschel-Burns, who is a postdoc at Princeton, and Kathleen Cunningham, who is a professor at the University of Maryland. So just as a reminder about how this will go, if you are in attendance, we invite you to leave comments or questions in the chat, and I will do my best to address those as we move along. We'll also do several calls for questions as we go through to try and make sure that everyone is incorporated. So we're going to have about a 15-minute presentation. Brandon will be taking that on, and then we'll turn to our three discussants. And I'll ask them to go in the order of announcements. We'll have Chris first, and then Danny, and then Kathleen. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Brandon. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Let me share my screen. Everybody see the screen okay? All right. Okay, well, thanks. Thank you again, Chelsea. My name is Brandon Bolte. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Springfield. I'm really excited to present to you all the results of this project that I've been working on with colleagues at Penn State about how contested governance between states and rebel groups affects civilian behaviors. So let's go ahead and get started. And let's start with the observation that most states actually don't exercise full sovereignty of government within their own territory. This map is from Borzel and Rees's book, and it illustrates the prevalence of this phenomenon of what they call limited statehood. Now, in many cases, the government has limited access to peripheral spaces due to limited capacity, geographical, socio-historical factors, but this type of phenomenon is pretty characteristic of most internal civil wars as well. So where armed groups seek to control new territory, they use more than just violence. They act as governors, they create courts, they provide social services and public goods, they tax civilians to extract resources. And we've learned a lot about rebel governance in recent years, in part because of some of the work of our excellent discussants. But we're still learning a little bit about how it affects people on the ground, right? The people who are living under these circumstances. And this is important because a recent estimate suggests that something like 210 million people worldwide live in places that armed groups either control or are actively contesting, with something like 80% of armed groups using some form of governance in these places. So we're interested in trying to understand whether and how these complex local political orders affect the ways in which civilians living within them interact with one another. And just as a preview, we find, interestingly, that civilians that have been living under contested governance compared to places that are kind of state-led control purely exhibit greater interpersonal trust, greater interpersonal trustworthiness, and less opportunistic behavior. Now, before talking about why that is, let me explain a little bit about what we mean by contested governance. It's an oversimplification to assume that during a civil war, there are territories where the state controls and governs, and then other territories where the rebels control and may govern as well. So this is a snippet from a news article about this phenomenon in India, which is where we did our experiments. And here we see not only evidence that the Maoist Naxalite rebels tried to act like governors, right? In certain places, they created these courts that the article calls kangaroo courts. But we also see an explicit recognition that there are these zones where neither the state nor the rebels have full control. And interestingly, these courts most frequently operate in these places that are, quote, held 50-50 by government and Maoists. Now, the fact that rebels use governance in spaces where the state or incumbent government is not absent means that we shouldn't think about local governance by competing actors as zero-sum. In reality, governance is not only dynamic during long-standing civil conflicts as the influence, capabilities, geographic spread of the armed groups kind of changes throughout the course of the conflict, but it's oftentimes multi-layered at the local level. And in practice, this can take a couple of different forms. Sometimes rebels and state institutions will operate in parallel to one another, kind of like we just saw in the courts example. And sometimes rebels do this to show that their system or their governance is more efficient or more just or less corrupt than other state systems. It's kind of a competitive dynamic. In other cases, rebels will, interestingly enough, forge kind of institutional partnerships of convenience by co-opting or latching on to existing state-linked institutions. And we can speculate about why that variation exists, but both exemplify this concept of contested governance that we're interested in because it's governance by competing actors in the same space. So we argue then that the possibility in these places of institutional forum shopping, expectations that the composition of local government in this context can rapidly fluctuate, and the undermining of the effectiveness of official state-linked institutions all create this environment of uncertainty among civilians with respect to what they believe they can rely on local government to do for them. And although that might lead us to believe that people should be less trusting of one another in these contexts, short-term survival or prosperity really instead simply depends on greater intra-communal cooperation. In other words, instead of relying upon administrative government, top-down government, to provide for personal and community well-being, civilians instead kind of detach from top-down government and instead shift to just rely more on one another, which over time can manifest as greater trust, trustworthiness, as well as less selfish interpersonal behavior. So that leads us to our core hypotheses, which are basically that civilians living under contested governance, at least compared to people who are living in kind of state-led, purely state-controlled territories, should exhibit greater interpersonal trust and trustworthiness and less opportunistic behavior. So we conduct our study in the state of Bihar, which is part of what's called the Red Corridor in India, where Maoist rebels called the Naxalites have been most active. And the reason that we chose this state, among others, is because it has about kind of the average number of districts that are identified as being left-wing extremist affected by the government of India. So we're not trying to cherry pick an outlier state that's either doesn't have a ton of Naxalite activity or has a lot of Naxalite activity relative to other states. We then did a lot of qualitative research as well as did a preliminary kind of statewide survey to identify where there were reports of governance by rebels in the past few years. And we found basically 9 districts in Bihar or so where this kind of activity that we saw in the article I showed you earlier was kind of most prominent. So then we chose 2 districts that varied in this experience with rebel governance, but that matched on a whole host of socioeconomic, geographic, political factors. So we selected these 2, Vaishali and Samastipur. And so again, they vary on this contested governance indicator, but they're very similar in a lot of other ways. And they have the added benefit, of course, of being geographically adjacent. From these 2 districts, then, we randomly selected 13 villages from each one for a total of 26 study sites. And we verified that these villages were not unbalanced between districts on a whole host of different factors. So in all of these villages then, our enumerators ran 2 experimental games, which we used to operationalize our dependent variables. In short, the trust game has kind of a sender and a receiver, and then the sender is told that any of their endowed 100 rupees that they give to the anonymous receiver is tripled, and then the receiver can decide how much money that they're going to send back to a partner that's also participating. And this is a commonly used game in behavioral economics to measure trust by how much money is sent by the sender, and trustworthiness, which is how much money is returned by the receiver. The second game is a dictator game, where essentially everybody's given an initial endowment, and those selected to be dictators can basically choose to steal rupees from others or give them. And we use this to generate a binary indicator for opportunistic behavior if they were trying to take stuff from other participants. And then we use these data to see if, on average, those people who are living in Vaishali exhibit systematically different patterns in interpersonal behavior compared to those who are living in Samastipur. We also have a bunch of other survey data that we use for controls and some extended analyses as well. But let's just kind of focus on our main results. So here I'm showing our estimated coefficients from OLS and logistic regression models with and without controls here. So in this case, if we believe the matching efforts, the balancing efforts, the things that we've tried to do here, we might generously call these average treatment effects. But basically, we see support across the board for our hypotheses. We see that those people who were living in Vaishali, the contested governance district, exhibited systematically greater trustworthiness, and a lower likelihood of opportunistic behavior. And we did a whole bunch of other additional analyses, matching methods and stuff like that. And in almost all cases, our results remain very similar. Now, these patterns that we observe, where contested governance is positively associated with prosocial behavior, could be due to a couple of different causal channels. And so we tried to test a couple of them in our paper. One, which is consistent with our argument, is that individuals are basically substituting for the state, right, by investing in interpersonal relationships, by looking out for one another. And this can lead then over time to positive norms in their interactions. And if this reasoning is correct, then we should see that people who maybe have a lower level of confidence in the state's ability to provide for the community should be particularly likely to exhibit these behavioral patterns due to their lived experience with contested governance. So put differently, contested governance should have a stronger effect for those people that have less confidence in the state's ability to provide goods and services to the community. This isn't a perfect test, but it's what we have, and I think it can get us some answers a little bit closer to what we're trying to find out. An alternative explanation, though, is that what looks like prosocial behavior in our measurement is actually the result of people in these uncertain environments wanting to avoid basically ruffling feathers. If people are nervous about the reliability of local security to protect them in just day-to-day interactions, people could over time develop risk-averse tendencies. And so we may be seeing what looks like prosocial behavior, but what's really just reflective of fears of appearing antisocial and kind of ruffling feathers in the community that could incur some kind of social pressures, marginalization, something like that. And if that were occurring, we might expect those that are living under contested governance to exhibit these patterns more if they also believe that there's a lack of law and order in the community. So again, this isn't a perfect test, but evidence that would be kind of supportive of this mechanism would actually be contrary to our broader argument. Okay, it make us kind of question that there's this state substitution thing going on, and instead what we're really picking up is not genuine changes in kind of prosocial behavior. So we tested these mechanisms by interacting our contested indicator with response data from our participant survey about these things. And just for sake of time, I'm going to just quickly show the results from our trustworthiness dependent variable models, in part because those look like some of our best results. But for the first mechanism, respondents rated their perceptions of government effort to provide goods and services to their community on a 3-point scale, from going kind of very little effort or believing that the state provides little effort to trying very hard in their community. And what we can see is that among those that believe that the government either among those that believe that the government gave only some effort or very little effort, we see that this kind of contested governance effect is much higher. So this, with respect to trustworthiness, and this suggests then some support for that first state substitution mechanism. We also asked respondents to identify major issues of concern in their community. And here we see then that living under contested governance is positively associated with trustworthiness kind of behavior, regardless of whether they identified a lack of state control in their community as a major issue. So we don't see evidence for that kind of ruffling feathers fear of retaliation mechanism here. We did see a little bit of evidence consistent with this in our trust models, but that wasn't the case in the opportunism models. And pretty much all of the extended analyses that we did that I'm not reporting here for sake of time, we didn't find any other kind of support for this, whereas our results for mechanism 1 were pretty consistent across the board. So what does all of this mean? We found perhaps a surprising result, that civilians seem to be genuinely more cooperative and trusting of one another, where governance is an arena for contestation between states and rebels. And we found evidence that this is due to an economic kind of disconnect from the administrative government due to the unreliability and uncertainty of governance in these contexts. Now, these findings are consistent with recent literature on rebel governance that argues that it can be a very effective tool actually for undermining the state. And our findings are also interesting in light of experimental work that has been done to using similar methods to examine how experiences with violence affect these same kind of interpersonal behaviors. We zoomed out to think more about kind of institutions and structural factors and whether they might matter. But it is worth noting that we also found no evidence that experiences with violence, personal experiences with violence, affected our dependent variable, which is kind of contrary to the literature. Bigger picture, this is really one of the first attempts at understanding the relationship between these two phenomena. And so there are, of course, generalizability concerns here since our study is so localized. But given how widespread these gray zones are of control in armed conflicts around the world, the kind of prosocial behavioral patterns that we're observing could have really important implications for where to target local peace-building initiatives, economic reconstruction efforts, et cetera, once conflict has subsided. So that's all I have. Thank you again in advance for all of the feedback that we're about to get. This paper is, I want to believe it's in kind of the end stages and hopefully will soon be ready for submission pending implementation of the feedback that we get today. And so we're really looking for advice on theory, mechanisms, framing, things like that. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon, and co-authors. So now we'll proceed to discussant comments. So we'll start with Chris. Go ahead and take about 5-ish minutes, and we'll proceed on to Danny.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you all of the authors on the call today. It was a fantastic paper, a pleasure to read. I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm happy to send you some if I don't get through all of them, but I'll move fast for the sake of time and try and hit as many as I can. So I think the first kind of maybe biggest theoretical thing that struck me is a potential alternative explanation. So we know that, you know, in these communities where civilians are kind of caught between belligerent parties, they have a lot of bargaining power, actually, vis-a-vis the groups playing off the kind of competition dynamic. And it's easy to imagine that like strong, cohesive communities have even more bargaining power than less cohesive communities vis-a-vis the kind of prospective governors that are involved in their areas. And so if successful bargaining requires like strong cohesion and cooperation, it could be that the effects that you're documenting here, high degree of trust, trustworthiness, less opportunism, is just a strategic move coordinated between the civilians in the village to enforce their own collective bargaining power, or to enhance their own collective bargaining power vis-a-vis the various belligerent parties, right, to demand more than it is, say, like fears of retaliation or just this simple need to kind of adapt to under like insufficient governance provided by the state. So I'm not sure if there's other questions in the survey that you could use to probe that mechanism, but that struck me as the most plausible alternative that you don't really test or rule out in this paper. In terms of the kind of causal inference angle of the paper, I think you do an admirable number of robustness checks, but there's two selection issues that really kind of strike me as warranting more conversation in the paper. One is the possibility of outmigration, right? We know that there's just tremendous levels of internal displacement within India, labor migration, people fleeing conflict, et cetera. And so migration, particularly, selection of less pro-social individuals out of these communities, such that only the kind of highly pro-social people who are like strongly tied to the local institutions remain, is probably like the most important selection problem. And again, not sure if you have information on migration status here, but that was something that I didn't see addressed at all in the paper, and could be a super interesting angle to build in as well. The second kind of selection possibility is that pro-social or like informal community institutions, right, shuras and things like that, and other contexts, they all predate the conflict. And so it could just be that rebels and state governors are attracted to and want to kind of control the communities that are high in pro-sociality because they are more economically productive, more kind of politically engaged, et cetera. And you argue at one point in the paper, I think it's page 21, that rebels really can't observe these kind of pre-existing patterns of civilian pro-sociality and target high areas for governance. That didn't exactly make sense to me, but I think to really understand that claim, we would have to know more about the recruitment process for the Naxals, right? Like if they're locally recruited, then they should presumably have a degree of information about the level of pre-existing pro-sociality of these communities. If they're not locally recruited, that might help you empirically. It probably also makes more sense for the theory, because if the rebels are outsiders, then it's more plausible to me that the civilians have to kind of turn to themselves because they have less trust vis-a-vis these outsiders. That kind of translates to a broader point that I was interested in here, which is that this argument seems to only apply in kind of non-ethnic, non-religious conflicts, right? In like ethno-religious wars, it seems like a harder claim to make that you would get this kind of cohesion emerging from competitive governance, right? Like, having studied Iraq, it seems completely implausible that mixed areas in Iraq, Shia Sunni areas, would kind of have this pro-sociality effect in response to contested governance, just because there's so much stronger in-group, out-group kind of bias. And so that I think would be important to address in like scope, conditions, and framing in the paper. Okay, a few other thoughts. I know I'm running a little bit close to time. So on the empirics, one last one on the theory. You kind of gloss over these differences in the quality between state and rebel governance. Not sure how difficult it would be to measure that, or whether you have that in the surveys, but it seems like the theory kind of assumes roughly equal quality. But I would be really interested in how disparities in quality of governance kind of feed into the broader existence of competitiveness, right? Competitive to me implies that they're roughly equal and you kind of have your choice, but if they're not roughly equal, then competitiveness looks very different. Empirically, I think there's a potential typo in the balance table, specifically table A8, right? Log income appears much higher in that table in the treated than control areas. And more broadly, I think to interpret the balance tables most efficaciously, you need to show us the standard errors so we can know whether these differences are distinguishable. If it is the case that treated villages are in fact more developed, that could be a consequence of higher prosociality emanating from the response to competitive governance, or it could suggest that there's some deeper underlying endogenous process happening, and that could plague inference. So I think that's an important one to hit. I would also really love if you could leverage variation in individuals' years of exposure to contested governance. It seems like the effect should grow the longer somebody in one of these villages has been exposed to this kind of competition between the state and the rebels. And more broadly, might be worth having some conversation in the piece about the challenges inherent in validating claims about rebel governance using retrospective survey evidence, right? More pro-social people could be politically aware, more politically interested, hence maybe they remember more of the governance that was happening in the past. And so you see this kind of mechanical correlation between pro-sociality and recollections of contestation or governance. One last thing, and then I'll send a few other points in an email. I think you should give us a clear substantive interpretation of the effect sizes here, right? When I hear 2.5 to 12 rupee effects, that seems super small, like 3 to 14 cents in US dollars, but it could be economically significant in these villages. And more broadly, I think if you want expanding on the kind of downstream economic consequences of the effects you're documenting would be a really interesting sort of next project, probably second follow-up. So would encourage you to go that route if this is something you're working on for the future as well. All right, great job though. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. Go ahead, Danny.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I really liked lots about this paper, and I think especially the focus on hybrid governance. I study Colombia. There's a lot of hybrid governance in Colombia, so yeah, it was great. I have 5 main buckets of comments. We'll see what I can get through. So the first one is, I think the framing about limited statehood, at least to me as someone who studies rebel governance, felt kind of overly basic. And I guess it depends where you guys are trying to send it, but I thought if this is, going to a journal about, conflict, I thought maybe for specialists, that's a framing that could be dropped and could save you some words. Um, on sort of the connection between control, violence, and governance. I thought one thing that was missing from this paper was how the concept of military competition connects to competitive governance. So I wrote a paper with Andres Aponte and Andres Uribe that sort of addresses some of this stuff. But I think it seems really important to me to address not just how individuals are exposed to violence, but how the dyadic relationship between the Naxals and the state potentially varies. How much are they actually fighting each other in sort of parallel to this competitive governance? Because I think that would affect interpretations of a lot of these things. Because if they're really not fighting at all, yeah, I think that's a very different world in which they're both fighting and competitively governing. Though I think in my own work, I'm sympathetic to the idea that sort of individual level exposure to violence maybe is not that important. But I think looking at the sort of relationship between armed groups is important. And then third, on sort of parallel versus synergistic versions of contested governance, I thought there's a bit of a mismatch in that the paper spent a lot of time talking about these two types of contested governance, but then empirically, they don't really seem to matter that much, because you guys say, well, the Naxals do both, which I believe, but it seems if it's not going to appear as important in the empirics, then you don't need to spend as much time on it. Also, I thought maybe it's the labeling issue, but the synergistic governance seems to be non-contested because they're working together in some ways. So it didn't seem to be a subcategory in the same way that parallel governance was to me. I didn't understand quite so clearly sort of what was being conceptualized as contested governance and not the people's courts. Are they competitive because it's forum shopping, or are the Naxals essentially reducing the state load for police? Sorry, reducing the caseload for police and state courts. Fourth, on mechanisms. So the you looking at whether people fear retaliation or whether there's evidence that sort of people are substituting for the state based on interpersonal reliance. Um, but I think that in the questions that you use to measure these are about basically people's views of the state, right? So in the substituting one, it's right, are people are concerned, sorry, yeah, are people confident the state will provide goods and services? And the other one is, are people concerned about the state's lack of control of security? But it seemed to me like there was the assumption there that people can't turn to the rebels for these same things. And maybe going to Chris's comment, this is about like the different quality of governance between rebels and the state. But it seemed to me to not directly address the mechanism because theoretically, especially in other conflicts, people very much can and do turn to rebels for these sorts of things. So it wasn't quite clear to me that these questions were getting at the mechanisms you wanted to. I also thought, I wondered if being less confident in the state, that the state will provide goods and services, does that actually translate to you being more confident in your neighbors? Or can it just mean that you don't think anyone is coming to help you, basically? Um, Finally, on identification, I got like 30 seconds. You say like the implementation of governance by Naxals, like the type of governance was sort of haphazard and down to personal preferences of leaders, which I think it's very possible. And you say this like helps your identification strategy, but I thought without like further description, it was a little hard to evaluate whether or not that was true. I think like Monteiro and Coker's article about double track rail lines in France during World War II is informative of how I think about this. Like, even though it seems like there's a good reason to think that that's true, but I think without sort of affirmative evidence of that, I think it's not as strong. I also, similar to Chris on an external alternative explanation, I don't think it's, I guess I'm similarly not concerned that, or at least to you, I'm similarly not concerned that Naxals chose to like where to contest governance based on interpersonal characteristics. But for me, the bigger issue is that like the same variable caused where they govern and interpersonal characteristics. So, for example, like Heinrich et al. Series of survey experiments with small scale societies around the world find that the economic form of production really affects interpersonal trust between people. So it's like, are the Naxals basically governing places where there's mining, for example? And does mining perhaps also increase interpersonal trust? I don't know, but I just thought about the sort of thinking about the connection between economic industries and interpersonal trust and how that could sort of lead to both the independent and dependent variables could be important to think about. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Danny. Okay, on to you, Kathleen.
Great. Thanks for sharing this research. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I'm also writing notes as the other discussants give comments, trying to not repeat some of the same things we shared. But I'm going to talk almost exclusively, I think, about theory and framing. So maybe that's a good pairing between me and the others as well. So right now, the paper is oriented around this robust and growing work on rebel governance. I think you do a great job presenting the state of this literature. In fact, as I was reading it, I was thinking, I better, catch up on my reading here. But I think for me, the challenge is that there's a lot of content on that, but I actually don't think it plays much of a role in the project. And what I wanted to see instead of that lead in on rebel governance is a contextualization of your study vis-a-vis what we know about pro-social and antisocial behavior, because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to explain. And so the sort of strong lead in on what is essentially your independent variable didn't leave you a lot of space for bringing your reader into the debate that's happening there. Now, this did get explored to a small degree when you're talking about violence and the role that violence plays on pro-social behavior and the experimental work on that. But that seemed to be the thing that was most relevant to the outcome that you're interested in. Sorry, my cat is now also trying to join the Zoom here. So one of the things that I noted sort of as I finished the article was that I didn't feel like that dependent variable was ever really explored conceptually in a meaningful way. And as somebody who does a lot of work in the space of rebel governance, but not in the space of civilian, pro-social, antisocial behavior, I really didn't know what I should be thinking about or what I should be looking for in terms of an understanding of how the theory was likely to work or not work. So kind of related to this framing is when I got to the conclusion, that actually seemed like maybe you'd come full circle. So the conclusions are sort of about why we should care about the impact of rebel governance on pro-social behavior. And this, I think, could actually be the lead-in framing for it. That is, recovery from conflict is difficult. Societies face a lot of challenges after the fighting stops. And then the contribution of this paper could be helping us to understand why some places are likely to have better outcomes based on their wartime experiences, and the ways that is created is through the individual interactions with one another. And what you're then saying is historically, we've really only thought about the legacies of violence in these contexts as determining who behaves in what ways, but we're going to look at the legacies of governance and contested governance as well. So that's sort of all towards the question of framing and how you enter into the literature. I think this dovetails nicely with Danny's comments about how much content you want to have on what types of literature based on kind of where you're pitching the article. But I think it also is about how to contextualize your contribution most meaningfully. So let me talk a little bit about the theory. I was sort of reconceptualizing my understanding of that as you did the presentation, which was really clear. And I think because of the lead-in with the rebel governance literature, I had a little bit of difficulty kind of getting to exactly what your argument is very quickly. Some of that can just be addressed with some framing and clarity. But let me also walk through what I think that the theory is telling us and which parts seem really compelling or less compelling. So the theory suggests that relatively high unpredictability of governance behavior, particularly around what rules matter and which ones are going to be enforced, is going to be central to understanding individual behavior in the community. For me, it wasn't entirely clear what the baseline of governance predictability would be and what we would expect for that to impact pro-social and antisocial behavior. The other thing that occurs to me is that you have this logic of, this is where you sort of kind of get into these different competing logics, this logic of the potential of the state to be a protector for community members. And this, I think, Chris also talked about, it's about kind of the pro or antisocial selfish behavior that you're talking about. To me, this was the least compelling part of the theory. And I wasn't, in some ways, it seemed to me like this was maybe a response to reviewers saying, oh, an alternative answer is this, because you really are making a different argument. And then you're presenting this sort of logic. I wouldn't typically think of state weakness or governance unpredictability as being something that would drive people to be less selfish, right? Another way to think about it would be that a lack of enforcement means you can do whatever you want, right? You sort of this anarchy. And this didn't really come out as clearly as I had hoped in theory to understand exactly what role this argument was playing for you, how important it was, or whether it was just something you were reacting against. Sort of related, there's this underlying sort of economic logic and development narrative that comes out kind of throughout the paper in different places, but it's not made as explicit as you might. And I think this is where some of that confusion occurs for me about what is the role of predictable governance. Is it that people are willing to invest in the more medium term, like the way we just think about in general the role of the middle class for economic development, or is there something else? And you really return to this idea of the economic arguments in the conclusion, but it didn't weave through the paper consistently. And then finally, I'll give two final notes. I actually did not watch the time at all, so Chelsea has to ping me if I'm going over. I think your explanation of what you did in the field and the experiments is nicely presented and well written. I I'd be interested as somebody who doesn't do in the field experiments to know what challenges have been raised to inferences from playing games in the field. I know this is a strategy people use, but I imagine that there are also some questions around what you can and can't infer from it. Um, and then finally, I think Chris and Danny talked both a little bit about this part of the paper already. I'm not convinced that the questions about state government delivery of goods and services reflects whether participants think they can rely on the government for help to protect and promote their well-being. And that's the argument you're making. And Brandon, you said in the presentation that this isn't a real close, as closely aligned as we might want, but this is what we have. I wasn't super convinced by these tests about adjudicating between the mechanisms because neither of them seemed sufficiently linked to the underlying logic. I also don't know that that's a critical problem for the paper either, because what I saw the paper doing was making a strong contribution to our understanding of the legacies of conflict for community behavior, and whether you can get to this seems like more of a question that arose that you can kind of speak to, but not really adjudicate, rather than a central component of the paper. And that may be different than how you're thinking about it. Let me stop there. Overall, this was really engaging, easy to read, enjoyable paper, and I look forward to hearing more.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Kathleen. So I'm going to give the authors a few moments to respond to these discussant comments, ask further questions, and then we can certainly circle back around to additional things that you may not have had time to say, discussants, unless we have any audience questions that get raised in the chat. So I'll toss it back to our authors to ask or clarify anything.
Yeah, I'll just say all of this is amazing feedback. Thank you so much. And it's especially helpful to see some overlap because that means that something's going awry a little bit. So some of this stuff is great. I just need to kind of think about it a little bit more. So I'll just kind of a couple of scattered comments. This idea Chris had about kind of out-migration, that's the kind of Gilligan et al. Paper argument too. And we thought about that a little bit, and I think maybe it would be worth revisiting that. It's a little bit hard to, I don't know if we might be able to think about something like how old people are there, or I can't remember if we ended up getting survey data on how long people have lived there in their villages. But if we have that, that would be really helpful, even if we can't get exactly at that mechanism. But again, I think the broader approach to kind of speak to Chris's comments as well as Kathleen's comments was that even if we can kind of find this pattern and then we can kind of come up with some explanations for it, that we can try to rule out some things and find some evidence that might point towards something that is going on, even if it's imperfect. And so the strategy here was not necessarily to make an entirely conclusive claim about exactly what's going on, as opposed to trying to get a sense of like a pulse on the phenomenon, and at least finding where the preponderance of evidence is leading us. That said, we clearly need to be a little bit more clear in the kind of discussion of the mechanisms as well. So yeah, I think that's kind of my big takeaway. I think also Danny's comment on the need to maybe reduce the discussion about the different kind of types of how contested governance can manifest. I'm glad to hear you say that, because that was something I was struggling with when I was writing that section of like, am I rambling? Is this like how relevant really is this? Because it isn't something that we test explicitly, but it is something that conceptually is only just starting to kind of come out in the literature. So I was trying to figure out if it was worth talking about or if it ends up being a distraction. And it sounds like at the very least I can kind of reduce the discussion a little bit. So yeah, all of this is really helpful. Thank you so much. And I'll think about this and we'll implement the feedback the best we can.
Okay, fantastic. I don't see any comments coming up in the chat. So Now is your opportunity, discussants, for anything that you felt cut off by the time limit, anything that you wanted to re-engage with, please feel free to go ahead.
I guess one thing that I was struck by is that I didn't see in the paper or appendix any ethics discussion. You'll certainly have to add something like that in before you submit to journals, but would love to hear any kind of reflections that you have on pitfalls or promise of doing field work like this in conflict affected places.
So it's actually there in the PAP. We did sort of write this up, and it went through IRB. We did have concerns about people working, the team going out in these areas, just because there is sporadic violence sometimes. And so we were checking in with them throughout the process. They would sort of, we would set up calls with them. We had emails, they had my WhatsApp number. And I essentially told them, if you feel unsafe, just leave, pack up and leave. What they would usually do is go in and talk to the village head before they even tried recruiting, to get a sense of what the violence levels were, whether there was, whether people would respond, strongly to an attempt to try and talk about the Naxalite era or something like that. So, just based on their feedback, they did not have any concerns. They had worked in these areas before, so they didn't have that experience, and they said, we're comfortable going back. And there were no issues that came up while they were actually doing the survey. And, they went back a year later, and again, it was not an issue. So we did monitor it, and, thankfully, nothing came up. But when we were designing this study, it's one of the reasons we didn't go into an active zone, because there are some districts there that were active, and we basically chose not to do that. Thank you so much for the comments. These are really detailed, so it's very useful feedback for us to work on, both theoretically and empirically. The surveys are long, and I'm very confused about which questions are in which surveys. So I think we might have some questions which can get to, cooperation with rebels. But I'll have to go back and look. And I'm trying to remember if we had a question that asked people if they had migrated to this area. I'm not sure if we asked them if they'd ever left the area, or if anyone in their family had left. So we'll have to try and tag and see if we can find other data on migration for that. So those are great suggestions. We'll definitely look for those evidence for both of those. Kathleen, I was wondering if I could ask you just to, and this is me because I was trying to listen and write at the same time. Could you just elaborate a little bit on your comment about how economic development was there at the introduction and and the conclusion, but you didn't feel it was kind of brought out in a way that was productive through the theoretical discussion? Like, what would you have liked to see over there?
Yeah, I'm happy to chat. Let me also take a quick look at my notes here. So I think for me, the question is this link between, or kind of where it breaks down a little bit is, so you've got at least contested, competitive, multi-layered, whatever you want to call it, governance happening, right? Like the state is not the sole provider of governance. And when you have forum shopping, this can lead to more unpredictability. And that unpredictability has some connective tissue then to individuals thinking about how they want to interact with the state, their trust in the state, and how they want to interact with their community. So their trust in the community. And that itself doesn't seem to have any economic grounds to it, right? This is sort of logic. So when Brandon did the presentation, you're kind of just walking through this idea that you've got unpredictability, you're going to kind of retract from the state and rely on your community. This actually brings up the one thing I was going to kind of return to if we had the opportunity is the role that time is playing in the story. So there are a few allusions to long-term conflict contexts, right, which is where we think we might have more of this kind of institutionalization of rebel governance. But also when we're thinking about the time horizon, that again appeared sort of like in passing that when there's less predictability, it shortens people's time horizons. And I then presume that the logic is that that's going to change the way they think about investing in, state-supported endeavors, or how they want to think about, arraying their allocation of resources potentially. But none of that is really coming out in the theory right now. So the kind of development side of it isn't sort of forward in the logic. Yeah.
So bringing in more on how that uncertainty would impact the economic choices people were making or considering when they're thinking about investing in the relationship as opposed to investing in the state, or thinking about whether they need to substitute for this, like what is affected about their lives. Okay.
And I think, what's affected about their lives, because the economic relationships and logic could be the dominant thing you're interested in, but it could be other things. And that's partly why I started with that question about, like, what do we know about the other drivers of prosocial and antisocial or selfish behavior? Because that to me seems like the thing you're really trying to explain. And so contextualizing the study there, and I think maybe Chris brought up, or maybe Danny, the question about, like, what kind of industries are these people in? What kind of economic relationships do they have with one another? Is this, an extractive area? Is this a agricultural area? These kinds of things would intersect, I think, with this logic more on the economic side, development side.
Yeah, so luckily these are both very rural areas. So, we have comparability on that in terms of industries and economic activities. But I think the point that probably we should make more strongly is that for economic cooperation to work, there has to be trust, and there has to be trustworthiness to revive local markets, to revive, local supply chains, local economic networks. And so that is embedded in this calculation, but I don't think we brought it out. So so we definitely take that point. Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
I guess just like also a follow-up kind of question. I'm thinking a lot about, I'm trying to think a little bit more about Chris's comment about kind of variation in, like, the quality of governance, right? I'm trying to I think you're right that something like this might matter. What I'm trying to figure out is what to do with it. And I wonder if you have any suggestions here, because as you suggested, obviously it's a difficult thing to measure. And so I want to be able to address it, but I'm really not quite sure how. Do you have any thoughts, any ideas on this?
I mean, the way that I think it's typically done, at least among people that study Afghanistan, which is the context I know probably the best, is just looking at survey data on preferences for going to a state court or a rebel-led court, or things like that. Who would you turn to if you had X problem? And this is like, there's variations on that survey question in a bunch of different ways and settings, and then looking at the accumulation of those responses is typically, I think, how people think about perceptions of quality of governance. Whether or not that's adequate, I don't know, but there may be evidence from other surveys in India that you could draw on if you didn't have something like that embedded. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I follow up with Chris quickly on one point? So I'm thinking about your point about bargaining power, right? And how there's this strategic effort to sort of come together in order to have a stronger hand when you're bargaining with different people. So, I mean, it's an intercaste conflict, even though it's left-wing, it's really aligned with these different caste groups that don't really socialize together, don't really, mix, in too many arenas. And so they would not really, I mean, we would still need to show something saying that somehow, the prospect of having to deal with rebels doesn't somehow overcome that, right? But given that the conflict is aligned with social differences and social factions, right? I mean, that's a higher bar, right? In terms of being able to forge these alliances where you don't have that social interaction before, right? And that exists in both of these regions. So we would still need to show that that bar has not been crossed in some way, right? But the nature of the conflict, I'm just thinking if that helps in persuading you, or what kind of evidence would I need to show to say, there's this intercaste conflict which matches with the factions that are fighting, right? So this is going to be really hard to come together to overcome that, knowing that the rebels are on one side of that fight, and so for both these factions to trust each other enough, right, to say that the rebels are fighting on the side of the low castes, and then for the low castes and the upper caste people to come together, right, so that they can bargain more strongly, knowing the rebels are not even-handed in that fight.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting detail to know. I'm by no means expert on the Naxalite conflict, so I think even adding qualitative details like that would help illuminate the context for uninformed readers. I guess it's not clear to me in the experimental games, like, are the villages sufficiently diverse in their caste composition that you can say that this effect that you observe is cross-cutting caste lines and hence the kind of relevant political social lines for the conflict? Or is it just that the low caste villager assumes that their partner in the game is another low caste villager, and such that you're estimating just an in-group effect, basically? This
Okay.
is maybe more like my point on like whether this generalizes to religious, ethnic, sectarian conflicts, right, where the in-group, out-group favoritism dynamic is highly salient. But that's all really interesting. I'd have to think a little bit harder knowing that context.
I know we have balance on the caste groups. I don't remember, so the caste groups are balanced, but I think to the point of who people assume they're playing with, right? Whether they think that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I think maybe we can. I don't think that's actually difficult with the data that we have, because again, like you said, they're matched. We also have like participant level matches. So I think, but also we can just kind of look at the distribution, like the caste distribution within. We could say something like, if there's just disproportionate or something like that in certain villages, then people might expect that they're, cooperating with a member of one caste versus another. So we could probably address that.
But none of the villages were like reservations, like for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, or is this whole area like the SC/ST?
I mean, they're all mixed.
Okay.
So there's some variation, but they're mixed. And the villages themselves are part of bigger administrative entities. The bigger administrative entities may be reserved, but the villages themselves are not, like the local councils are not.
Yeah, that would all be really interesting detail.
But it sounds like we should be putting in some of that detail.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, I'll just do, I guess, a sort of a final call for any comments or questions from either the audience or any of our discussants or authors.
I want to make sure one of my co-authors knows the paper that I think Danny was referring to when Danny, you were talking about the haphazard argument, and you had cited a couple of papers and said that that's a good model to follow. Could you just repeat the reference?
Yeah,
I'm
wait,
not
sorry.
an AR person.
No problem. I think those are the haphazard argument about what?
So the fact that we were saying that the unit leaders kind of made the decision to exert governance or not as an individual decision.
Yeah, it's Montero and Coker, 2016. Nuno Montero and I forget Coker's first name, but yeah.
Yep.
Are you guys know that? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
we did have a longer qualitative discussion of that. That's something very difficult to pin down. I mean, you raised a very good point, Danny, but I think that's the best we can do, frankly. I mean, the points that Chris has raised, we can concretely address. And there's a second round village survey that Brandon didn't have time to present, which is there and talked about. But this point that you raised and the point that Kathleen raised in terms of tying the links to arguments of opportunism are going to be the most challenging ones, frankly, to address. But we'll give it a shot. We'll give it a shot.
Okay, great. Well, we will conclude here. So thank you again to our authors for some really fantastic research. I'll look forward to seeing more of that in the future. Thank you as well, of course, to our discussants for taking the time to read and to offer such excellent comments in what I know is a very busy time of the year. So extra kudos to y'all. Thank you. And so you can find this presentation if you happen to miss the beginning. It'll be posted on our YouTube site, which is linked on the General Peace Science website. And so that goes for the authors as well, if you want to watch back through and revisit what the discussants said. And certainly if you are watching this, we encourage you to, as needed, send, if you have comments that you think of later, please do send them to our authors. So thanks all of you for being participants, and we hope to see you in another OPSC soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Thank you.
for the feedback.
Thanks, Chelsea.
For organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you.